Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome back to Final Trade. So I got really good feedback on a video I did about 2 weeks ago that was just the casual stroll through the current TCG market where I covered Magic, Flesh and Blood, and Pokemon, what the prices of the recent boxes were, and just kind of my thoughts about them. I wanted to do something kind of similar to that today with One Piece and Lorcana. And the difference is I don't have a lot of long-term faith in these products, but I want to see how they've been doing. In November of 2023, my patron newsletter talked about the kind of, I guess you'd call them marginal games at the time. It was One Piece, Lorcana, Sorcery, and MetaZoo, and I kind of touched on Weiss because I think Weiss is, kind of has its own interesting peculiarities. And in the conclusion to that article, I said that I think those games, those four in particular, excluding Weiss, that essentially they would kind of bumble along and not really do that great. They would remain third tier TCGs. They would have pretty poor investment performance, and that worst case, one or two of them will outright fail in the coming years. And of course, that would turn out to be partially true a lot quicker than I had expected when 3 or 4 months later, MetaZoo folded and shut down. So, right after that, in about January, only about 2 months after I published that article, we kind of hit the peak of crazy, irrational exuberance on these new games. And that's what you're going to see reflected in the price performance that I'm going to show here. And we hit a point where we had a lot of people in the kind of TCG investing ecosystem who thought that Sorcery and One Piece and Lorcana and MetaZoo could all just see great returns. Or maybe one or two of them could see great returns. And my argument was essentially there is not enough money that can flow in to the individual ecosystems of each of those games in order to get the prices to do that. There are not enough players with enough money and enough time to support that many games. That's why historically Magic and Pokemon have been the two winners for almost 30 years now, and everyone else kind of takes a back seat to some degree. Now, Yu-Gi-Oh is kind of its own different thing because of the way the game is managed, but you're either going to be a Magic or a Pokemon, or you're going to be running second place. And I was very skeptical of what a lot of people were claiming about the ability of these boxes to just stay at crazy prices and continue to ascend, and for these games to kind of replicate that performance. Because when you have a game first come out, you'll see that the early boxes of the game, which have the lowest print runs, those almost always do pretty well. You go back and you look at things like Welcome to Wraith First Edition, Arcane Rising First Edition, even Crucible of War First Edition is still somewhere around $300 or $400 a box, which is pretty good performance for the third expansion of a game. But you fast forward to the more recent Flesh and Blood expansions, and they have normal performance. And normal performance is what you have to focus on for the long term, because not everything is the first box of a game. The normal performance is what you're going to get on average in the long term. And that's when you have to start looking at network value theory of TCG investing to say how much money is coming into these games, how many people are actually playing the games in order to choose the winners and losers in the long run. So, with all that aside, let's take an actual look at prices and price performance over the last year. I've gone in on these plots that TCG Player provides here, and I've zoomed them all out to 1 year timeline. So this is Opus 1, and these are the original boxes, not the reprint boxes. And what's also interesting is TCG Player has these other listed items here of Japanese and Korean language romanced on boxes, which, of course, to kind of fit in with the way boxes are sold in those markets. They're smaller boxes, so they're cheaper. And so that messes up the horizontal axis because it's averaging in a bunch of those sales. I think probably the shape of this plot would be very similar. It's just the horizontal axis would scale differently if we removed all of those other boxes. I wish TCG Player would finally go ahead and just add Japanese products to its marketplace. I mean, people want to buy Japanese One Piece. They want to buy Japanese Pokemon. I'm sure there's one guy out there who wants to buy Japanese Magic. Just do it, TCG player. So we stopped messing up the data like this. Now, the other products are not really so messed up, but the way you can tell is you can come in here and you can see these $95, $95, $95 sales that are pretty commonly sprinkled throughout. If there are only a couple of sales, rarely of those foreign language boxes sprinkled into these data, then it really doesn't mess up the calculations much. But we can see that kind of that January time frame here is when things peaked, and then it trailed off. And so it fell back down and it's leveled out now. And $900, again, you've got that first box effect where the print runs are not high enough, where the game starts to take off, the player base grows rapidly at the beginning, and the early boxes can appreciate very well. And so if we come back to here and we say, well, maybe this data point back here was closer to valid, $200, and it's $900 today, hey, that's a 450% return in 1 year for the original printing of the box. Now, we've got the second printing of the box, which only released recently in June of this year, and so that's not a great data point, $234. What you would expect is, to a slight degree, this would pull down the price of the original printing of the box if the game is more focused around people actually playing, opening boxes and wanting the cards, because this would be a cheaper alternative. Now, if the game is more focused around collectors and investors putting boxes back in the closet, then you won't see as much of an effect because of the release of these boxes. It's the same thing with the early Flesh and Blood boxes. The unlimited versions of the early Flesh and Blood boxes did not do much to hurt the prices of the first edition boxes on the long timeline. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Opus 2. So this one was actually released back in 2023, and you can see how its price has just made a round trip through that kind of hype and hysteria area here in January of 2024, where it took a first peak and then it took a second peak, and it's come way, way down. What's also interesting is as it's come down, you see the volume by these blue bars there has increased a lot. And so people stopped buying when it was peaking up there at $350, and then they picked up buying again when it got cheaper. Now, hopefully that means that smart investors who have long-term conviction on this game came in and said, hey, it's really cheap. It's fallen 50% or more. Let's come in and buy it, throw it back in the closet. And to some extent, hopefully that means that players were coming into the game in that time period and were able to pick up early boxes cheap. It's hard for us to say just looking at the data here. There's not enough data for us to tease that out, but it should be some combination of the two. Overall, though, what you see is that, like I said, the hype period that kind of peaked in January of 2024, the prices are way, way down off of that. Opus 3, $219 today. You can see that it again had a first peak there around January, a second peak a little bit after, and it's down a bit, not nearly as dramatically as the previous one. Opus 4, $160 today. Now this one's actually kind of held up to that hype period. It would be interesting to know whether they're going to do reprints of this, whether they have done reprints of this. The volume is very interesting. So the light blue bars behind there is volume. That's sales for every period across the graph. And what you can really see from that is the volume is way down, but the price is held. And that's why I would guess that they haven't had much reprinting of this particular product, because if you came back and you dumped a whole nother tractor trailer full of this product onto the market, well, the price would have to come down. But if the volume is this low and the prices remain elevated, it's probably because there aren't many boxes available. And of course, here are all the Japanese ones. And then we get into English language. Yeah, there's probably about 60 boxes there if I had to estimate without taking the time to count. And Opus 5, $157. You can see it took that round trip and came back down, peaking near $300 market price, and then back down today to $157. So nearly a 50% drop off of the peak of the hype cycle for all of these, again, kind of marginal games. Opus 6, $97. And now this looks more like the TCG expansion lifecycle. This doesn't really look so much like the period of hype that was happening at the beginning of this year and at the end of last year. This looks like the pre-release sales began, it shot up, and then when it released, you see the bars of very high volume right here around March, and then it comes down. So it looks like the market kind of got its fill of the product. Interesting that it saw another great resurgence in sales. I would really wonder what that is for. If a lot of investors are coming in and buying it up, or if for some reason a whole ton of new players all of a sudden join the game all at once. I'm really skeptical of that, but it would be interesting to know why there's that second huge spike in volume there months after the initial release of the product. And moving on, Opus 7, $97. This is exactly the TCG expansion lifecycle. This is what you expect to see: pre-release sales at high prices, and then more stores list the product as they get it into their hand. Eventually it hits release day and the price crashes down and the volume slowly dwindles off with it. So this is actually what we expect and seems pretty healthy. But you can see from a lot of those plots, we did hit that peak of the hype over these kind of games back there at the end of 23, early 24, and it's come down a lot since then. Now, if you have long-term conviction on One Piece, you think it's a great game, you think it's going to survive, you think that they'll really put together good competitive worldwide competition, events with big prize pools, you think that the publishers of the games will nurture it very well and responsibly for the long term, then hey, this is the time to be buying. And this was Extra Booster 01, $123. And again, this is just TCG expansion lifecycle stuff. It's not an old enough product to gauge what it was doing back in early 2024. So moving on to Lorcana, $214 per box. And of course, remember that Ravensburger always said that Lorcana was going to be print to demand. They were going to reprint as much as they needed to make it accessible to players. And so that's why from the very beginning, I was skeptical of this as a long-term investment. I've not bought any Lorcana. I've also not bought any One Piece. And we've seen them carry through that promise and bring reprints and bring the price back down. So going back to the 1 year, this peaked all the way at about $385, maybe close to $400 market price nearly a year ago, and then crashed down once it got the initial release. It came back up a bit to about $300 before a big reprint wave hit, and then the price became a little more accessible again, and it came back down. So, long term, will this do really well? I suspect there are so many boxes of this put back in closets already. The one thing you always have to ask yourself with any type of investing is what's the cost of doing something different, or what's the potential reward of doing something different. And so if you were to just buy Pokemon, which has proven over decades that it consistently returns 15, 20, 25% per year, do you think Lorcana is going to beat that? It could. It's pretty unlikely, and it's unlikely set to set to set that Lorcana will beat Pokemon's proven long-term performance. And so while you could get very lucky on a couple of these Lorcana or One Piece or MetaZoo or Sorcery boxes, the odds of you getting lucky enough, consistently enough with these small and marginal games is very low. Remember, Pokemon has probably the most money pumping into it over any time period, probably more than Magic. And that makes its networked financially the most robust. And it gives it the ability to return money to the makers of the game, the distributors, the stores, and investors. And if people are not pumping money into that TCG network surrounding any particular game you invest in, there's not as much money for you to draw out. And that's kind of the basic fundamental of why I'm so skeptical on all these marginal games. It's difficult for a new game to grow its network to a critical mass where it can command that kind of money. And then you have to hold on long enough. You're taking a huge risk and it might pay out. and odds are it won't pay out as well as just buying Pokemon. On to Chapter 2, Rise of the Floodborn, $145 with the shipping. And again, this just looks like TCG expansion lifecycle. It looks like it just got released. The volume was high at the beginning. The price came down because everybody knew that it will be reprinted to satisfy the market. And everyone was willing to either wait, or stores knew that they could not rely on holding it in the back and waiting to sell it at a higher price later. Chapter 3, Into the Inklands, $110 per box, standard TCG expansion lifecycle. All of these Lorcana boxes are on average newer than the One Piece boxes, and that's why we're not seeing as long of a data history on them. And Ursula's Return, Chapter 4, $99. Same thing. See, it's come down to what Ravensburger says they want the boxes to cost, because distributors and stores know that Ravensburger is not going to be holding anything back, and they're not going to be shy about the reprints. And finally, Chapter 5, Shimmering Skies. That's the first time I've heard that name. And again, standard stuff, getting into the releasing, and the price coming down. So, you know, when I wrote that patron newsletter back in November, and I was skeptical on those 4 games and then also on Weiss, I had a lot of conversations with people afterwards, and it was interesting because people were, as you would expect, kind of all over the place. Some people believed in all the games, some were skeptical of all the games, some believed in particular ones and were skeptical from different ones, and there were all different combinations of that. And so it's been interesting. I've gone back and I've reread a lot of those conversations now, preparing for this video, just to kind of see what people had been saying and what the reasons were. And you know, it's especially interesting when I read the ones where people were very bullish on MetaZoo and One Piece, because as you've seen, One Piece has come back off of the peak of the hype cycle now that it was on back in that November, December, January period. It's come way down. And of course, MetaZoo failed and folded and is in bankruptcy proceedings as of this point. So I think the thing to keep in mind is always think about network value theory. Understand that if you're going to be putting these boxes back in the closet for the long term, someone has to be prepared to buy them in the future. And it's more likely that you will find someone who wants to buy them if that game has a healthy, valuable network in the future. That's why dead TCGs mostly have very poor returns on investment, even after decades of being dead. It's because no one plays them. No one is desiring to open the boxes. No one is desiring to collect them. No one is desiring to hoard the seal boxes in displays in their office. You need those things in order to be able to extract money out of the network in the future. So that's why Pokemon remains the blue chip asset of TCG investing. That's why Magic is second. Magic makes a lot of great products that perform well over the long term, as long as you're at least a little bit discerning about what specific Magic you're buying. Some is better than others. I think Flesh and Blood still has amazing potential because it is very well managed. The group of people designing the cards, running the competition, doing managing the meta, all of those things, they're very competent. They understand what they do. They take it very seriously, and they're looking to long term also. And so I think Flesh and Blood will continue to slowly grow over time, and those print runs that people freaked out about when they were released will turn out to have been way too small when we look back on them another 5 or 10 years from now. I think these other marginal games, Lorcana, I don't think will ever have any investability because Ravensburger says that they will print whatever the market desires, and they're just looking for a game to get people into the Disney sphere of influence, to get them into this kind of stuff and to spend some money. They're not looking to create a collectible that has long-term value. One Piece I'm a bit skeptical on because, yes, it's an IP tie-in game, which I made a video about recently. It's not as harshly tied into the eventual fate of IP tie-in games because there is so much story, so many seasons of the cartoon that they can draw from. It will just remain to be seen if it goes the same way as all the other games that that publisher has put out in the past. And of course, MetaZoo already failed. Sorcery, I think, has a chance. I'm very neutral on Sorcery. So I know some people I've talked to have kind of gotten irritated that my neutral stance seems to be negative. And no, it's not negative, it's just very neutral. It remains to be seen. Sorcery's big thing that I can't tell how it will play out yet is that they will not be releasing expansions very often. I can't yet decide if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It remains to be seen because it's such a weird and different way to manage a game. So think about network value theory of TCG investing. Think about where the money is going to come from that you're going to try to capture in the future. What games, what products can help you capture that. Because if you just play into the hype, you see boxes going up, well, that's unnatural. Boxes aren't supposed to come out and immediately appreciate 3, 4, 500%. And we saw that recently with Fallout collector boxes over in Magic. They spiked up to 600, 650, and then they've had a healthy pullback down below 500, where they're kind of sitting sideways for a little while. You don't expect huge run-ups without a substantial contraction afterwards. And that's what we've seen with all these One Piece boxes we looked at that were released at or before the kind of peak of that secondary game hype cycle in late 23 and early 24. Let me know what you think, guys. Any ideas you have, questions you have about this stuff. It's interesting to come and look at this once in a while and just see what these other games are doing. But like I said, I haven't put any money into these other games, and I still don't plan to, because long term, I do not think they're going to do as well as Pokemon and Magic. Thanks to everyone who makes this content possible, especially my very generous supporters on Patreon. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and join me on Final Trade.